Hello, welcome to Let's Get Real. I'm Nina Simons, and today's episode is what we call a quick take. I haven't done one of these since season 6 launched, so I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you. I have been thinking a lot about what I wanted to talk about, and the big topic for me is around how to be in healthy conflict. I work a lot with couples and with teams, and one of the main things that we're working on is how to have productive and positive conversations even when we disagree or when that system disagrees or is out of alignment in some way. Conflict is a natural part of being in a relationship system, and the better we can get at being in conflict in a productive and healthy way, the better I think it can be. So, one of the first things I want to do is just distinguish between healthy and unhealthy conflict. What do I mean by that, right? And so, for me, healthy conflict is when we are able to be productive and stay in relationship with the other person and have that other person and ourselves feel heard. And by the end of that conversation, we feel a greater sense of belonging in that relationship rather than a reduced sense of belonging or disconnection in that relationship. So it also can lead to better outcomes because we are actually airing things and getting clearer and aligned on things that maybe we've been avoiding. So that's what's exciting to me about healthy conflict. Unhealthy conflict, on the other hand, is more about creates unproductive outcomes. And so it's like we don't get aligned and things get more divisive, and we actually end up maybe even harming the relationship or having the other person feel worse and ourselves feeling worse as a result of that conflict. And so that's the risk that people worry, and probably why we're often afraid to even have those difficult conversations is because we're worried about creating harm, and unhealthy conflict actually does that. So I want to talk a little bit about the 4 toxins, relationship toxins, that are characteristics of unhealthy conflict, because I want you to be able to assess in your own relationships if these are happening. And I also want to say, as I'm sharing these 4, that it's not about getting to 0 on these, because a lot of these behaviors are kind of hardwired in because of our need for survival, our need to be right, our need to be in control, all of those kind of egoic tendencies that don't just disappear. Doesn't matter how much work you do on yourself or how much development you have, you're always going to, sometimes when you're tired or just under pressure, some of these behaviors will come out. And so just being aware of them is the first step towards maybe eliminating them or at least reducing them. Maybe not eliminating them, but reducing them in your life. So that's the main reason I want to share them with you. And I want to make sure I'm giving you the source for this, and I'll put this in the show notes, but I did the training with CRR Global. That's where I learned about the toxins, and that's when I started using them in my work with couples and teams. And I also, the originator for this is from the Gottman Institute, John and Julie Gottman, who did a bunch of research. Dr. John Gottman did a bunch of research with couples in his lab and noticed that these 4 behaviors, if they showed up frequently and early in his interviews, that usually was a sign that relationship would end in separation or divorce. So that's how toxic these behaviors are. And I really do see how they play out on teams as well. So these are also fitting for the organizational context. So without further ado, let me tell you what those 4 toxins are. They are criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt. So some of them are more of an attitude, and others are more of a direct behavior. And so we're going to talk about each one of those now. And then I want to share at least 3 antidotes with you, things that you can do instead of the toxic behavior. So I think that's the most important thing, is what do I do instead, right? So let's start with criticism. So criticism is an inclination to look for and point out faults and defects. We are often critical when we have an unmet want or need, but what happens is that people feel judged by us and they feel disrespected. even if we're only criticizing the behavior, and sometimes we are being so critical that the person actually feels like you're criticizing them personally. So this can be happen at work. So perhaps, say you're Sue's at a team meeting and Tom is 10 minutes late, and she ends up believing or saying that he doesn't take his work seriously. The reality is that Tom may just not be good at managing his time, or may just be overwhelmed. So we don't really know what's going on, but usually the person who's criticizing has a story about that, and it's not always accurate. So that's toxin number one. Toxin number two is defensiveness, and defensiveness is often the response to criticism. No one likes to be criticized, and so what happens is we go to defending our position, and we stop listening. So that's why it's a toxin. Otherwise, you'd be like, well, of course, why wouldn't you defend yourself? Well, the reality is it often takes us out of relationship because the other person doesn't feel like they've even been heard, and that defensiveness can also lead to a kind of a lack of vulnerability that also has people trust us less when we're defensive. So that's the drawback of defensiveness. The third toxin I want to talk about is stonewalling. Stonewalling is often a more passive toxin because it's usually about the silent treatment or just refusing to engage and withdrawing from the relationship. And sometimes it also includes cutting off communication. So stonewalling can happen in an active way, like during the conversation when someone withdraws, but it also can happen, I've seen it often happen in organizations where people just don't respond to emails. And it's actually an intentional attempt to regain a sense of control in the relationship. And often it's because the person doesn't feel safe to share. But it's toxic because it takes you out of relationship and out of any ability to joint problem solve together. So that's why stonewalling can be pretty harmful. And then finally, probably the champion of all the toxins, and when I say champion, I mean it in the most negative way, is the toxin of contempt. And this one is usually is more of an escalated toxin, and usually only shows up after the other three have been present for a while. But contempt can include things like being sarcastic or belittling other people. It is often a direct put down of someone else, and it often has that person feel disrespected. Ironically, contempt is sometimes employed by folks who are feeling powerless themselves, or maybe they're feeling a little insecure. And so in an attempt to feel stronger, more powerful, they end up moving beyond criticism to just not really even seeing the other person as, they just kind of look down on them. And so it can be a pretty unhealthy of all the toxin. It's probably the one that can do the most harm, because there's actually been studies that show that relationships that have a lot of contempt in them can actually create poor health in the people who are experiencing that contempt. So it's a very dangerous one to keep an eye on, and to try to do your best to not employ in your relationships, whether they're with peers or with your spouse. So those are the toxins. Kind of icky, kind of depressing, right? Let's talk about what are the antidotes to those toxins. And I'm going to share three with you, three of my favorite ones. You may actually want to get my list of the other 6 or so. But one of my favorite antidotes is to actually make a request. Behind every criticism is a wish or an unmet request, as I mentioned before. So think about how can you change your criticism to a request. So instead of getting upset with your partner because they've left their dirty clothes on the floor again in the bedroom, transform that. Like, will you put your laundry in the dirty clothes when you get undressed? Like, that's simple, right? So that's an example of making a request. The second antidote I want to share with you is to articulate emotions. A lot of times we have the idea that negative emotions are unhealthy. But the reality is that all of our emotions are part of our humanity. And when we are able to share our feelings openly and honestly, it builds trust if we do it in a responsible way. So you can create awareness in your relationship by articulating how you're feeling using I statements, right? So, and really the trick here is to actually express an emotion. So what you don't want to do is express a criticism, an emotion as an emotion, a criticism as an emotion. Like, I feel attacked is not really an emotion. I feel nervous because you're yelling is an emotion, right? So very different energy, and there's a lot more ability for the other person to respond. If you say, I feel attacked, it can sometimes actually lead to more defensiveness from the other person. But I feel nervous, or I feel unsafe, or I feel sad, I feel irritated, all of those can actually be honest expressions of what's going on for you in the moment. And it's not about the other person fixing any of that, but it is about being clear and keeping our emotions from leaking out in more reactive ways. So that's the beauty of articulating emotions. It also can keep us connected to what we call our prefrontal cortex, rather than getting what Daniel Goleman calls an amygdala hijack. I know those are big words, but the amygdala is the closer to the survival part of the brain. And when we get overly wrought in a conflict, that part of the brain can get activated and keep us from being responsive and even being able to think rationally during a conflict. So that's the beauty of articulating emotions, is it can help us self-regulate. So that's the second antidote I wanted to share with you. And then the third antidote is actually what I would call a more passive antidote. This is from the work of actually a book called Becoming a Conflict Competent Leader. And that is to take a time out. So when I say passive, you might think, well, passive isn't good, right? Well, actually, sometimes being overly active during conflict can create more churn and can escalate things more. And so it's okay, especially if you've been going at it for a little while, for you to take a time out. And this is different from stonewalling, in that you are actually being intentional about it, and you're not doing it to control the situation as much as you are to bring yourself back into more regulation, to actually give both people or everybody in the conflict a chance to regroup. It's actually a way to be mindful. And the timeout could be 15 minutes, or it could be, can we revisit this tomorrow after I've had a good night's sleep? The important thing, if you take a timeout, is to do your best to actually communicate that to the other people that you're in conflict with, or the other person, so that they don't misinterpret it as stonewalling. So taking a timeout is perfectly appropriate and a great idea, because again, of what we were talking about before, rather than having your survival brain running the show, you can get everything back online. The other person may actually also benefit from the timeout. So that's the beauty of taking a timeout. It's just a wonderful way to be healthy during conflict, which is what this conversation is all about. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. I hope you found this conversation useful. You know, for me, it really is about creating a greater sense of safety and belonging in our relationships, so that we can do more good stuff together, whether that's stuff at work, stuff at home. How do we nurture relationships, because they're such a key part of living our best life. And so I hope you found this helpful. Please write to me if you have any questions about what we've covered or want more of the resources, but I will definitely put some of this in the show notes. So I hope you'll leave us a review if you found this episode useful, or share it with a friend. Always great when other people know about the show. Take care.